Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programs are funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So as you can see, today's interview is a little different than our normal ones. We have the great pleasure of welcoming Colonel Carl Singer back with us today. And today we're actually going to do a more formal presentation, and then we're going to ask some questions at the end. So Colonel Singer, thank you for having us. Or thank you for being here.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Dustin. This was supposed to be a live lunchtime session several months ago. I went hungry. And I very much appreciate his ingenuity in moving this to Zoom. Zoom is a wonderful tool, but it has two shortcomings from my perspective. It's recorded. So if I say something stupid, actually not if, but when I say something stupid, it's there for posterity. It's on the record. So that's just the way it is. The second is I spent many years giving interactive presentations at IBM with their Advanced Business Institute. Doing so, I could see heads nodding in agreement or eyes glazed over because something was too deep for them. And occasionally somebody's snoring in the back of the room. I thrive on feedback. So if you're going to snore, turn the volume up on your microphone. And I appreciate that I can see Dustin, so at least he can wave at me and tell me that I'm either on track or off track. As this first slide shows, Americans have served American, I'm using that in quotes, before there was an America. Since 1654, 366 years of patriotic service. I want to thank the Jewish war veterans of the United States of America, who I was past national commander a couple of years ago. And specifically, I want to thank the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Most of the slides you'll see have their logo on it because I borrowed their slides because, again, they've done a lot of research in this area. Again, Jews have served for a long time. Again, this presentation was initially a face-to-face presentation, so I want to begin with an icebreaker that I used frequently at IBM. It doesn't work well with two people, but consider it next time you're giving a presentation. Tell three things about yourself, only two of which are true. Keep it light. We don't want to hear about your bout with some evil illness or something of that sort. This is the one I always start with. When Colin Powell and I were office mates, I had the larger desk. I'm fluent in 3 languages, and I was born on a freight train. Let me take a minute, grab a pencil and paper if you're there, and think of 3 things about yourself. Again, only 2 of which are true, and keep it light. And saying that you're 20 years old and you're really 21 is too close to the truth. Okay, Dustin, I see you're writing.
Okay.
Okay, you want to go first or should I go first?
I can go first, sure.
Okay, sure.
So I wrote that it's 2 truths and a lie, that I was honored as a Kentucky colonel in the state of Kentucky, that I was honored with the Techie Award in my senior year in high school when I went to school. And last one is I was awarded in college the Theodore Roosevelt Award, which included a scholarship.
Okay. I actually happen to be a Kentucky colonel. It's a long story. A friend of mine bought it for me, essentially, 20-some years ago when I made colonel. I'll go on the high school as being the one that isn't true.
Okay, so I did get the award, but it was my junior year, not senior year.
Okay. So let me go through my 2 truths and a lie.
Mm-hmm.
You want to guess which one it is?
I can, but I know one of them is already a truth, so I don't know if that's cheating.
Well, the one that's a lie is the second one.
Mm.
Reading right to left, I only speak two languages, Yiddish, which is the language of my heart,
Very nice.
and English, which is the language I tend to use most of the time. Um, when Colin Powell and I were office mates, I did indeed have the larger office. And number three, because I wanted to be near my mother at the time, I was born on a freight train. This was in post-war Europe, somewhere along the Polish-Ukrainian border. I need to explain the Colin Powell thing because it sounds a little bit too egregious.
Yes.
When I worked after basic training, I ended up in the Army Chief of Staff's office, and we were in a team. Consider this rectangle, a set of offices at the Pentagon, a hallway. Behind those four eagles where colonels had their private offices were windows through a little gap there. And a bunch of lieutenant colonels were out in what I would consider a bullpen. And I'm the specialist four. I was the young guy, the new guy on the block. And one day, one of the colonels went off to a different assignment. So we had this empty office here with about a dozen or so folks who might sit there, but they would be upsetting their peers. Think of you and all the folks you work with, if all of a sudden you're the guy who shows up and takes the big office. So they gave it to the junior guy. Partly because I needed it. This was the day before lots of real computers, and I had the old 10-key adding machines and such. I needed to spread out because I was doing a lot of work that needed a lot of data, but mostly because these guys really were a team, and they figured give it to the junior guy. He needs it, and we don't want to be seen as the as the guy who took the big boss's office. Caused some many strange looks when a stranger from another office walked in and saw Colonel, and me. Anyhow, let's get off of that. Here's a quick mini bio, and if you stay awake through this, I'll get into the presentation. As noted, I was born on a westbound freight train somewhere along the Polish-Ukrainian border. I have a cousin who was 7 days older than me. He was born mostly, I think he thinks, in Kazakhstan. He ended up in Israel and was Israel's ambassador to Greece. That was his last posting. Before that, he was the Israeli consul to New York City, which got my late mother and I into all sorts of fancy parties. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is, again, the source of my Midwestern accent. In May of 1970, I was drafted. I was a grad student at the University of Michigan. I'd followed my prof from Case Tech out there. And I ended up going from basic combat training, that 8 weeks where they make you tough and rough and whatever. I had played soccer in college, so that wasn't much of a challenge. And I ended up in the Army Chief of Staff's office, which was quite a transition. I served as an enlisted soldier for a couple of years and then went into the reserves, retired as a colonel. Actually, I made colonel about 10 years before I retired. I didn't even know it. One spring morning, I called up to get my next assignment, and the person at the other end of the line said, "We can't help you. You have to call the colonel's branch." I'd been promoted, and nobody told me. So I went out, bought a beer, and bought 2 eagles for my shoulder, and that was it. Again, I served with the Army Chief of OCSA, Office Chief of Staff, U.S. Army, the Secretary of the Army for Research and Development, where I worked on something called telemedicine. A little bit bigger scale than what you're seeing today when you call up your doctor over Zoom. Think of a small field hospital in the middle of a battle area needing to get medical advice from, say, Walter Reed, and sending digital x-rays and high definition videos. I work for Doctor Training and Doctoring Command, which is where the Army figures out what it's going to look like in 10 or 20 years. And for the last 10 years of my career, I commanded a bunch of other gray-haired colonels at the Army War College, USAWC, U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is a beautiful place. A lot of folks end up retiring there. Again, I was National Commander of Jewish War Veterans from 2016 to 2017, hence this fancy hat. They give you a hat. And they give you another one when you leave. It says past National Commander. So it's a 2-hat gig. So it's pretty good.
I would love if I got like a free bow tie for, at the beginning of this job and at the end of this job and years from now.
Well,
But
you need to lobby, or you need to have a tradition of bow ties. I've been married for 42 years, 3 sons, 6 grandchildren, and fortunately they all live nearby. I can walk to one, I can drive to the others. So unlike many of my friends, I don't have to make hotel reservations and flight reservations to see them. And I've done all sorts of work. I got a call when I was finishing up my dissertation from an old friend who said, "Do you know anything about econometrics?" And I honestly answered no. And he said, "You're hired." So I did foreign, my career's been like that. I did foreign exchange forecasting for a sub of Chase, then the Chase Manhattan Bank. I've done a lot of computer research, my dissertation's area, and I've managed project managers. Okay, done with the boring stuff. Let's talk about the presentation itself. You still awake?
Yep, I'm still here. So
Okay.
very excited.
In 1654, before there even was an America, there was a place called New Amsterdam, and 23 Jews came from Recife, Brazil, to New Amsterdam, and they founded the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, a beautiful edifice now, the current one, over 350 years ago, 366 years ago, roughly. For those of you not familiar, New Amsterdam became a small town that we know of as New York City, or Manhattan, if you want to be more specific. And Asher Levy, who was one of those 23, petitioned to stand guard. He wanted to be like all the other citizens he wanted to be a citizen, but like all the other citizens, he wanted the responsibility of standing guard. That's what Wall Street is about. That was a wall. Peter Stuyvesant was reluctant to have this happen. As I said the last time around, he was anti-Semitic, and since he's gone, he can't really defend himself, so I'll be light on that. It turned out management got involved. The Dutch East India Company, which was management, included some Jews, changed his mind, and thus Asher Levy got to stand guard and essentially became the first citizen of that little colony, long before there was an America, but nonetheless he was there. And again, because of this and the follow through, Jews were granted this privilege, and thus they became citizens of New Amsterdam. I'm going to jump over 100 years into the future. You folks remember 1776 as being the year that we talk about the start of the United States. There was some Jewish influence on the founding fathers, both culturally and financially. I'd recommend a really heavy book. This is not a weekend reading. Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik, who is now the head. They call it. I'm trying to think of the appropriate term. He's the minister of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. That's what they call their rabbi. He wrote a very heavy book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, which intersperses biblical verses with equivalent thought in the founding of America. Again, it's an excellent book, but it's not casual reading. There was even some talk of having Hebrew be the language of the United States. That would have been funny.
That would have been interesting.
It would indeed, because just like English, the United States and Great Britain are two countries separated by a common language. Mm-hmm. I imagine Hebrew, as it would have evolved, would have been quite interesting. If you look at the dollar bill, I just want to jump over here. Look above the eagle, part of the Great Seal of the United States. Those are the 13 colonies represented there. You notice they're in a Magen David. That may have been a geometric ploy, but it also may be some hint of some influence.
Yeah, I haven't noticed that before.
Yeah. I didn't either till I read it, so I had to grab a picture of a dollar bill and again, above the eagle, you'll see those 13 stars, 13 colonies,
Yeah.
and forming into a six-sided shape.
Yeah.
Jews fought in the Revolutionary War. That's a good starting point for, beyond Asher Levy and being a guard.
Yeah.
And there's a Chatham Square Synagogue in Chinatown. When I spoke there in 2019, and quite frankly, we couldn't find the place. My wife and I drove down there. Parking was miserable, but worse, it's a tiny little, you can even miss it if you're walking, let alone driving by. Here's a picture of it. I don't recall the clotheslines. Those clotheslines may be sort of an optical illusion. That is, they may be part of the buildings around the outside of this. Again, a very tiny cemetery, but you'll see several dozen headstones and such. And it over the years, Manhattan has banned cemeteries downtown, so to speak. They're all out in Queens and so forth. But this one is right in the middle of Chinatown, and many of the folks here are deceased Revolutionary War warriors.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, I lived in Philadelphia for several years. Chaim Solomon is reputed to have helped finance the Revolutionary War. Going back to, again, some more detail, Jews still were a tiny fraction of the population. And there was a Colonel Mordechai Sheftal, who was the highest ranking officer in the highest ranking Jewish officer in the Continental Army. But wait, Colonel Solomon Bush was the highest ranking Jewish officer in the Continental Army. This is just to show that history is not exact. Unlike today, where every time somebody sneezes, there's a video of it. Records weren't exacting and such, but we know that there were two colonels, at least, in the Revolutionary Army. There were also two Franks in the Revolutionary Army, David Salisbury Franks and Isaac Franks. Okay. I don't have much about Isaac, but David, this is a drawing of him. If you read the plaque, he was an aide-de-camp to General Benedict Arnold, and talk about associating with bad people. It happened. People thought he was complicit in Benedict Arnold's treason. Arnold, as you may recall, wanted to give West Point, right, on the Hudson, to the British. It turned out he was on again, off again. He was eventually exonerated. He died of yellow fever pretty much as a pauper. And one of his neighbors basically rescued him from a poor person's grave. He was going to go to Potter's Field. And as a result, he's buried in Christchurch Cemetery. If you read the really small print at the bottom, you'll see it's part of it's in Philadelphia, part of the Philadelphia Historical Society. So we have this gentleman. And here's one of the brag things here. Half of the first graduating class at West Point in 1805 was Jewish.
That's incredible.
It is. But to put this into a little bit more perspective, his name was Simon Magruder Levy. Simeon later became Simon. There were two people in the first graduating class. And he, what was the old joke? The American finished second from last, and the Russian won. The Russian was one behind him or something. Simeon sort of disappeared. The other graduate was much more noted. He sort of disappeared in terms of his military service. Then comes the War of 1812, and one of my wife's cousins is an Annapolis graduate, and he saw what I said last time. He said that I really slighted this gentleman, Uriah Phillips Levy. And I said, wait till the big presentation. You'll see much more about him. He basically reshaped the Navy. The Navy at that time in 1812 was a pretty rough place to be. Among the things, first of all, he faced anti-Semitism. I think he was court-martialed 6 times. I think thrown out of the Navy 3 times. He did dress well, as you can see. He abolished flogging. Think in the terms of 1812 versus the terms of 2020. That's the way things went on ships. He was also, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to ask, can you briefly just explain flogging for anyone who's not familiar?
Well, if you got a whip and a chair, corporal punishment, which is physical punishment, was one of the ways of exacting discipline. And in the Navy, it was flogging. I've heard of cat of 9 tails and so forth. Basically, something with leather and lots of straps, and you hit somebody with it. Today, we think of it as cruel and unusual. It is cruel and unusual, but in those days, that was the way things were done. Levy was also a philanthropist after he got out of the Navy, and the most noted thing he did, and my cousin was very happy to see that I mentioned this. He paid for the restoration of Jefferson's Monticello. It had fallen on disrepair, and nobody seemed to care much, and he cared. Let's jump ahead now from 1812 to the 1850s, the Civil War. There were a number of German Jewish immigrants who came to the United States in the 1840s. It's estimated, you can read the slides as well as I can, but over 7,500 Jews served for the Union Army, and about 3,000 served for the Confederacy. So we have troops on both sides. Chaplains were allowed under orders from Abraham Lincoln. Chaplains are an important part of a military. If you watch a match, you always see Father Mulcahy, but they're chaplains of all denominations and so forth, and they provide spiritual guidance and such. One of them was Rabbi Jacob Frankel, and the other was Rabbi Henry Gotthelf. So because Abraham Lincoln saw the need for Jewish chaplains, because there were Jewish troops, they became part of the Union Army. And some Jews earned the Medal of Honor. Now, it's really nice to say, oh, all these Jews earned the Medal of Honor. Well, there were some mistakes made, just like we had 2 colonels who were the highest ranking officer in the Revolutionary War. There was Abraham Cohn. There was Isaac Goss, but he wasn't Jewish. He was mistaken for someone named Isaac Gans. Again, we didn't have word processing and the internet at that time. Abraham Greenwald, sounds like a nice Jewish name, was an active member of the Methodist Church. Henry Heller was a Baptist. Here's a real one, Leopold Karpeles. And Leopold was a strong abolitionist, lived in Texas, and moved up to the North, and fought for the North. I'll show you a little bit more about him. And someone with a name like Levy must be Jewish, right? Turns out he identified as a Methodist. And there was David Urbanski, who indeed, so I have 3 Medal of Honor recipients who through research were Jewish in the Civil War, at least 3. I want to talk about Leopold Karpeles a little bit, and his brother Emil. Brother against brother. Emil stayed in the South. I don't know that they ever confronted each other, but Leopold fought for the Union Army, and Emil fought for the Southern Army. There's a little bit about Karpeles' Medal of Honor. He had gone all the way up to Massachusetts and served. He was from Prague. He died in 1909. In the Wilderness Campaign in Virginia, as a color bearer, he rallied the retreating troops and induced them to check the enemy's advance. That's not uncommon during the Civil War, that the flag bearer who got the troops back in order and stopped the panic and such ended up getting getting a Medal of Honor, or at least a high recognition. Here's an interesting letter. Robert E. Lee in the Confederate Army got a letter from a Michelbacher,
Mm-hmm.
and Michelbacher wanted to get furlough for Yontif.
Wow.
I know. I spent one Yontif at Fort Campbell. Wasn't the greatest place for Yontif if you're used to a nice air-conditioned shul or something of that sort. But he requested furlough for all the Jews to observe the Yontif, and although the answer was no, it's interesting to see why the answer was no. Basically saying that the Jewish soldiers were too important to the Confederate war effort to let them go. Oh, let me add one other story. There is a story. I don't have the slide for it. I don't know how apocryphal it was, but a soldier knocking on someone's door, must have seen a mezuzah on the door. He needed a place for Shabbos. So here you are in the middle of the wars took place, in and among the countryside. It wasn't some far off islands or whatever. And here he was. He needed a place for Shabbos, so he knocked on the door. Max Frauenthal. I'm going to have some trouble with pronouncing the name, as you'll see in a few minutes, somebody else. He was from Bavaria. He lived in Brookhaven, Mississippi. That's south, as you'll recall. He enlisted in the Confederate Army.
Okay.
And he was in combat at a battle called Bloody Angle. The Civil War historians will tell you all about this battle. I will not, because I don't really know much about it, other than it was indeed bloody.
Appreciate the honesty.
Judge Watts, who I guess was a leader there, I don't really know his position. He mispronounced the name. You see, he calls him Frauenthal instead of Frauenthal. But look at what he said about him. Frauenthal, a little Jew, insignificant in appearance. He's a small guy, at the heart of a lion. And he goes back to the Bible and basically now he understands how a small number of Jews could drive out the 100 kings. They were all Frauenthals. So basically, Max Frauenthal was quite a fighter. And there's a book, one of many books, one by Simon Wolf, and that's actually, I think in Philadelphia, you'll see that statue, who wrote about the American Jew, patriot, soldier, and citizen. That book was written, I don't recall the year now, long ago, let me put it that way. The statue you're looking at is in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. I recall seeing that when I lived there.
I think
1895. I should read my own slides. Excuse me. I want to switch a little bit now to the Jewish war veterans of the USA.
Please.
That's the logo. In 1896, after the Civil War, there were cries that Jews didn't serve. That's something we've heard after just about every war. 63 Jewish Civil War veterans came together in March of 1896 in New York City and formed the Hebrew Union Veterans. I got to actually be there, not in 1896, but
yeah, you look very young then.
I'm a little bit younger than that, but the place where they met is now a hotel. And in the lobby of that hotel, the hotel turns to be one of the managers of that hotel is the son of a Jewish war veteran. And through some generosity from that organization, if you walk into that hotel, you'll see a plaque on the wall.
That's nice.
That here on March 15th, 1896, I was there, I think, March 15th, 2016. At this point in time, at this location, the Hebrew Union Veterans was formed. And here's a picture of some of them. You see wearing their uniforms. Lots of medals and such.
I do have a quick question.
Sure.
In regards to them meeting, was this specifically just the Union troops, or was this ex-Confederate and Union? Because as you mentioned, there were Jews on both sides of the war.
To the best of my knowledge, it was mostly Union troops. Part of that is geography. This took place in New York City.
Right.
So there weren't a lot. There weren't a lot. Well, now I'm looking at the uniforms. I see. Well, I think it's just the lighting. I don't see anything that looks like a Confederate kepi, except for those two on the very far left.
Yeah.
But I really don't know about that for sure. I'm looking at the age of these folks. I need to add that Mark Twain, among other notables, had passed on that Jews did not serve.
Mhm.
And he was disabused of that, and he later corrected himself, much to his credit. He corrected his previous statements. So here we have an organization formed in 1896. Next year, by the way, is our 125th anniversary. Each year on Veterans Day, the Arlington National Cemetery hosts the various veterans organizations, and next year in 2021 we'll be the host organization, meaning we'll provide the food and such, have food people show up. From 1900 to 1912, there were other organizations. There was the Spanish-American War Organization called the Hebrew Veterans of the War with Spain, and among others, I think Theodore Roosevelt, yep, he had some Jews who were part of his Rough Riders, so he was named an honorary member. Remember the Maine?
Yep.
It's a history lesson for us all. There was also this Hebrew Union veterans and the Hebrew Veterans of the War with Spain. They worked together, but they were two separate organizations. And they combined in 1912 and took on the very catchy name of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association. And among many things that they did, they secured legislation which previously had banned Jews from serving the New York State Guard. This is early 1900s, and there was anti-Semitism, as you might imagine, there still is in certain organizations. Then came World War I. You should hear some music in the background over there. This is fortunately a silent presentation. They joined with several other civic and religious organizations and formed the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, which exists to this day. Chaplain Rabbi Captain Ellison is now the head of the JWB. Does a great job of reaching out to our troops and such, and vetting chaplains and such for all the services.
That's great.
In 1918, the JWB was designated, as you see here, for endorsing rabbis. I won't step into this quagmire, but who decides who is really a rabbi when it comes, or a minister or a priest or anything else? The military wants to stay out of ecclesiastics. So basically, it's defined certain organizations. The Catholic Church, for example, has somebody, but basically certain religious organizations, they vet someone as a chaplain, as a minister, priest, an imam, whatever, because the Army doesn't want to go into the filtering process to say, okay, this guy really is properly ordained and this guy really is not. So the JWB took over that responsibility. Over the years, by the way, the JCCs are now the parent to the JWB. It was the other way around at first. The JWB was essentially the first organization, as I understand it, in that domain. So we have World War I. I hate reading slides, so you can read this for yourself. But over 200,000 Jews served in World War I. Again, the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, was formed. A lot of Russian immigrants joined the Army. Here's a picture. I don't know why they didn't get rid of that stripe in the middle.
Mm.
For money, they can do anything. I have some old pictures that were resurrected. You'll see in the building in the background is a Jewish Welfare Board building, and you'll see a number of World War I soldiers. You can tell them by their puttees. That's the leggings they're wearing, and their hats, their campaign caps. And there were, I see, two women who were probably most likely volunteers with the JWB.
Very nice.
Here's a family. They didn't label it, but looking at the difference in size, I would say that the one on the left and the one on the right are siblings, Jay and Benson Reisman, who served in the 26th Division during Europe. I love those uniforms.
They are very snazzy. I do like the hats.
And they immediately date you and make you think of World War I. In 1924, the JWV changed its JWV as in Victor, Jewish War Veterans, changed their name to Jewish War Veterans of the Wars of the Republic. Very catchy. And they issued their first copy of their newspaper, which still flourishes today.
The Jewish veteran.
And this was significant. How would you like to know that your relative is buried in a government cemetery and there's a cross over his grave instead of a Star of David?
Yeah.
They got that legislation passed in 1928.
You know, I've often wondered about that because, you know, I've seen some with Stars of David, but I always feel like there's so many more that I never see. So,
There's some issues. There's a 2-star general who was killed in combat in World War II, and his dog tags listed him as Methodist, and that's the way he's buried. There's a cross over his grave, Maury Rose. Now I'm going to pull out. Try not to choke myself.
please don't. I mean, you know, this would be an interesting show, but you seem like an expert. I want you to be okay.
You can't do CPR over Zoom, huh?
I could try.
I could try. This is a little over 50 years old, and it says Jewish on it.
Okay.
That's I guess 50 years ago it said Jewish. Some years before that it said H for Hebrew.
Okay.
There are stories, some interesting stories in World War II of Jewish prisoners of war. In one case where, I'm jumping around, but in one case where a physician seeing a wounded Jewish soldier got him the dog tags of a non-Jewish soldier who was deceased. So the Germans wouldn't identify this POW as being Jewish, which would have caused him further tsuris. Tsuris is a Latin word, and meaning problems. And additionally, there was a unit, and I don't have the slides for this, but there was a non-Jewish sergeant who, in the POW camp, he was the ranking officer, and was asked, which of your folks are Jewish? And his response was, we all are. And he refused to divulge which of his troops were Jewish. And many years later, his son was honored because of this. Let me go a little bit further through the Jewish war veterans' history.
Please.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, please, doesn't keep going. I want no more.
Okay. In 1928-29, they chartered a ladies' auxiliary, which is important because they do a lot of work. They're the brains and the muscles, and sometimes the cohesion, the cohesiveness, the glue that holds some of the posts together. And finally, in 1929, they thought of a catchy name, the Jewish War Veterans of the United States of America, which is what they're known as to this day.
Yeah.
1933, Germany was rattling its sword, so to speak, or rattling its sabers, and JWV organized a boycott of German goods in the United States, and also a large march. They marched again, New York City happens to be, or New Amsterdam, as you may want to call it, happens to be the epicenter of a large of the large Jewish community, and therefore of a large JWV community. 4,000 veterans marched onto City Hall. And they were able to get admission of German refugees into the United States. Nonetheless, we had the USS St. Louis and other cases where shiploads of refugees seeking asylum were turned away. The other thing is volunteers fluent in German, of course, could help those arriving immigrants.
Sure.
And JW grew a lot right before World War II, and into the decade of the world, all the soldiers coming back from the war. I wanted, well, actually, let me mention this also. This was an organization that began and didn't survive the Sons of the JWV. If you're familiar with the American Legion, they have a very active Sons of the Legion, including sponsorship of baseball leagues and such. This was great in 1939. It petered out within the last 10 or 20 years. JWV and the auxiliary, this is why it's important to mention the auxiliary, they sold war bonds and they purchased 7 fighter planes. It's great to have a one-on-one, you know, I'm giving money and here's the result. I gave money and now we have some more planes, as opposed to I gave money into some amorphous fund.
Is what you're at, yeah.
The first plane was called the Jewish War Veteran, and the second plane was called the Star of David. I guess planes 3 through 7 didn't get named, at least on the slides. But again, they got the money to build 7 fighter planes. World War II, over 500,000, 550,000 Jews served. They served in Europe, they served in the Pacific, and they served at home. I want to speak briefly about German Jews who came to America and served. They were called the Ritchie Boys. I'll tell you about Helmut in a moment. Fort Ritchie, Maryland was where they were trained. You have folks who know the enemy. They know the language, they know the culture and so forth of the German people.
Right.
So what better people to become intelligence officers and such. The first one I want to mention is Helmut Bodenheim. Helmut was a neighbor of mine in Philadelphia. He was very reluctant to speak about his military service, but seeing that I was in the Army, he opened up a little bit. Helmut, who spoke with a little bit of a German accent, spoke perfect English, but he had that accent you could hear. He was a driver for William Rehnquist, who became Chief Justice of the United States. He worked as an interpreter during the Nuremberg trials. Again, his language skills were significant, and again, as one of the Ritchie boys, he did that. The other person I want to speak about is Harry Ettlinger, who lived out in Wayne, actually. Harry passed a few years ago. Harry was an engineer in the United States. He spoke, again, with a little bit of a German accent. If you've seen the movie The Monuments Men, you'll see there's a scene where some guy named Shapiro was listening and overhears the German prisoners speaking, and of course, being of German heritage, knew what they were saying. The people who made the movie thought that Ettlinger was not Jewish enough of a name. So in the movie, his name is Shapiro. And as I mentioned last time, he served as a technical advisor to this movie, and he got to meet all sorts of celebrities, and he got to the opening, the grand opening of the movie itself. And as I embarrassingly said last time, I thought that George Clooney should have played Shapiro, not somebody else, because again, Harry was a great guy. It was wonderful knowing him, and just by coincidence, he was in this movie called The Monuments Men, because that was what he did when he came to Europe as an American soldier.
Mm.
There are a number of stories of folks, Jewish soldiers, who were liberators at the camps. Ich bin ein Amerikaner Jid is a sort of broken Yiddish for I'm an American Jew, but can you imagine? I knew one fellow who actually spoke at a class I was taking, who was among the liberators. It's just an amazing situation where you have American soldiers who speak Yiddish and entering a camp. You'll recall also that General Eisenhower demanded that the folks document what was going on when he liberated the camps. Arthur Seltzer was the gentleman I was thinking of, who he was a signal officer hanging wires atop communication wires, but he ended up in that situation. Arthur, there are a number of videos when he was interviewed. Arthur again passed a few years ago. 1948, the Jewish Welfare Board transferred to the JWV, with the approval of the VA, responsibility for claims of veterans and so forth and so on. Imagine after the war, a number of veterans who were hurt or ill or had illnesses during the war, and the VA had a lot of paperwork to do. This was a huge number of soldiers and so forth and so on. And the JWV ended up taking over that responsibility. April 4th, 1948, a huge parade. This was in support of Israel. 250,000 veterans, 90 bands down Fifth Avenue. Again, New York City seems to be the epicenter of much of this. I was in a reserve unit for a year or so after I came off active duty, and there were 2 or 3 folks, interesting folks. The one would disappear all the time to go jumping out of airplanes. He was a paratrooper in World War II, and found out later on that after World War II, he ended up in Israel as a combatant. And again, as you may know, in May of 1948, when Israel declared its independence, there was a little war that took place. All 5 different Arab nations invaded, and the JWV on the state side helped collect uniforms and so forth and so on. And some soldiers participated. The Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, I was reading recently, had a total of 4 airplanes, one of which crashed. So they were down to 3 airplanes, but they were affected. And of course, all those airplanes were flown by American pilots who had been trained and so forth and so on during World War II. I think the planes were from Czechoslovakia, I'm not sure. The Korean War had many folks who were Holocaust survivors in the U.S. military. The first part I read about was because I grew up in Cleveland, and some of these folks were from Cleveland. There's an article in the Cleveland Jewish News that goes back to there. Ted and Al Hirsch were brothers, and Joe Klein was a friend of theirs, and they all ended up in the Korean War and ended up in the same unit, so they knew each other. I want to speak briefly about Tibor Rubin.
Sure.
An interesting fella. Tibor was a Holocaust survivor, had lived in the camps, and he was captured by in Korea, in North Korea / Chinese, and used his skills as someone who had lived through the camps. Medical skills such as dealing with an open wound, somebody else's open wound, and so forth and so on. He refused repatriation to Hungary. The North Koreans / Chinese, I'm not sure which, said, "Hey, you're Hungarian, we'll send you back to Hungary." He refused. He stayed in the camps. This is way too small to read, but I'll read the last sentence. Corporal Rubin's gallant actions in close contact with the enemy and unyielding courage and bravery while a prisoner of war are in the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. He received the Medal of Honor. Um, I was privileged to be out in California. They flew me out. Walking would have been hard. Um, a VA hospital, a beautiful chrome and glass, shiny VA hospital, is now called the Tibor Rubin VA Hospital. Again, he used his POW and concentration camp skills to help fellow POWs survive. Okay, in 1954, the JWV moved its headquarters to Washington, D.C. I guess New York real estate was, and also we do a lot of lobbying. We stay on top of national issues and such. And the National Museum of American Jewish Military History shares the same building. It is quite a heavy research foundation and such. Mm. And taking us a little bit closer to today's dates, we're apolitical. We're by our congressional charter, veterans organizations must be apolitical. Mm-hmm. And if you see somebody standing behind a candidate wearing this hat or an American Legion hat or a VFW hat or whatever, they're breaking the law. I mean, they're not going to get arrested, but we are an apolitical organization. We can march on July 4th, but we can't stand with a specific candidate. Okay. In 1963, we were the only veterans organization. It bothers me today that I see a lot of, I'll be political. I see a lot of, I saw it into this morning's paper, Farrakhan, and somebody quoting of a Philadelphia Eagles football player quoting a bastardized version of what Hitler's Michelbacher said, that white Jews took away the heritage of blacks who actually, so forth and so on, the Bible. Again, we were the only veterans organization that marched with the Reverend King in 1963. That's a social statement, not a political statement. And we were heavy into the Soviet Jewry, the March for Soviet Jewry, and basically the really successful effort of getting Soviet Jews out of the Soviet, getting Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union, getting Jews out of the Soviet Union. There's a huge range of numbers in terms of how many Jews fought in Vietnam. And one that I know, gentleman I've met a few times, it's about 5'2", Jack Jacobs. Okay. He's a Medal of Honor recipient, wounded, carried other wounded soldiers back and forth in the battlefield. Last time I saw Jack speak, he spoke for a group called the Dental Volunteers for Israel. And Jack is about 5'4" tall, and he his other speaker, the other gentleman speaking, was about 6'6" or so. And he basically said that when you're in combat, you want to be about this big. You don't want to be conspicuous. But Jack is a hero and a Medal of Honor recipient, and as such, he's an honorary national commander of the Jewish War Veterans. John Lee Levitow, you'll see that's the Air Force by the wings. Both the wings and his patches there. John Levitow was on an airplane, and a flare got caught on it. He basically jumped, sort of the equivalent of jumping onto a grenade. He jumped onto a live flare that saved his airplane. Again, this is very small, but I'll read the end of this. Sergeant Levitow, by his selfless and heroic actions, saved the aircraft and the entire crew from certain death and destruction. Sergeant Levitow's gallantry, his profound concern for his fellow men at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, are in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Air Force and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country. The story basically, if you want to read this, you'll have the slides to look at. A piece of ordnance of some kind ripped a hole into the plane, and had he not done what he did, the plane would have basically exploded, and that would have been the end of the entire crew. And the bullet point: in flight, badly wounded, jumped on a lit flare and saved his plane and the crew. Now we go to Iraq and Afghanistan. Each February, March, we go to the New Jersey delegation, and other JWV delegations goes on the Hill, as we call it. We visit all the congressmen from our state and the two senators and all the representatives. Those in New Jersey will remember Frank Lautenberg. Outside Frank's office were 50-some pedestals, each with a picture and a citation on it, of soldiers who were, I'm sorry, not necessarily American Jewish soldiers, but New Jersey soldiers who were KIA in Iraq and Afghanistan. The museum, the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, as you'll see in the upper right corner, has identified 56 American Jews who were killed in service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Excuse me. In 2002, we are a strong advocate for Israel. We're also an advocate against anti-Semitism and such. We participated in 2002 in a rally, the largest ever held, we're told, in Washington, D.C. Regarding Israel. And we're coming down the home stretch. We support veterans. There's a video I think I mentioned earlier. I got my 5 minutes to speak before a joint House-Senate Veterans Committee. I'll give you a link to that later if you want. We support veterans, period, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. Many of our folks go to the various veterans homes. Here in New Jersey, there are 3 veterans homes, one down south, one in Menlo Park, in the middle of the state, and one in Paramus. Unfortunately, as you may have heard, the one in Paramus had significant COVID issues. So we try to lobby for a strong VA. We deal a lot with homeless veterans. As I said in my congressional testimony, and I think many others have said the same, one homeless veteran is one too many. A country as rich and as blessed as America is should not have veterans sleeping on the street. I have another presentation on that. We represent veterans before Congress. Whenever a veterans organization speaks before Congress, it carries a little more weight than just somebody coming off the street speaking. We support Israel. We fight anti-Semitism. For example, if you see an anti-Semitic act, swastikas on a building or something of that sort, we have somebody who will put out a reward. We will honor the local police department, so forth and so on, who follow up on such issues. And that's all, folks. Please, any questions or whatever? Thank you.
I won't ask too many, just because obviously I want people to, absorb everything that was said. And obviously I encourage people, because there was a lot of material that was said, to rewatch this video to get all the information. But I guess a very simple question, simple in asking, very hard to answer. Jews have been involved with every single American war, and obviously pre-America. I'm curious if do you think there's a specific drive that makes Jews want to serve their country in this manner?
I'd like to say yes, and I'd like to say no. Yes, in that they're no different than any other Americans. So what makes Americans want to serve? In some cases, because dad served and grandpa served and or grandma served. Um, and the one, and I want to say, no, Jews are no different than anybody else. On the other hand, um, I think, at least for my generation, um, and I don't stand out in that generation. I'm among a generation of refugees who came to this golden land post World War II. I think for my generation, it's a chance to give back.
Mm.
On the other hand, there are also some socioeconomic people who, if you go look at a reserve unit now or a National Guard unit, you'll see an overwhelming number, and this is just gut feel, I don't have data, of minorities, folks who look at the military as a way to learn a skill, come out after however many years to get GI Bill to go to college and so forth and so on. You don't see a lot of folks. I used to live on the Philadelphia main line. You don't see a lot of, let's say Upper Montclair for New Jersey. You don't see a lot of folks from really prestigious, rich is the word, neighborhoods joining the Army because of opportunity. I think they join because of a sense of service, but there are folks who join because this is a way out of the ghetto, or this is a way out of, I can't afford to go to college. If I join the Army for X number of years, I'll be able to pursue a dream of going to college. I know someone, actually, she is Jewish, a daughter of friends of ours, who is working as a medic right now in the Army. She enlisted a few years ago. She's young. Everybody's young when you're a certain age. But I think her game plan is to transition from being a medic to having the military pay for medical school for her. That's a rarity, but a rarity in certain social circles. So again, in one way, Jews are no different than anybody else. In another way, some feel the Hebrews hakoras hatov. They feel a sense of goodwill, or they've received goodness. They want to be respectful to that and pay it back. But again, a lot of that is socioeconomic. If you look at the socioeconomic strata of people enlisting in the Army, we don't have a draft now. If you look, you'll see it's skewed. It's also rural, urban, and so forth. Additionally, I'll get on my soapbox for 2 minutes. The draft. I was drafted in 1970. My dad had died. I was paying the mortgage on my widowed mother's house, et cetera, et cetera. But I lived in a draft board that needed bodies. It needed bodies. I had a friend who lived the next town over, Shaker Heights, Ohio, which let's call that the Upper Montclair or whatever. I don't really know the richest areas of New Jersey. His draft board was gerrymandered to include inner city Cleveland. That'd be like having a draft board that includes Newark or Patterson and so forth and so on. He didn't get drafted. He had allergies, you know, and basically the draft was unfair then. It probably still would be unfair if it was reconstituted. But again, I think Jews have served, will continue to serve. Surprisingly, if you look at the number of Jews at West Point or the Naval Academy and such, if you look at the number of Jews in the Army, there are a lot, and they serve well. I'd like to say that there's no distinction. That would be a sign of victory, I guess, that there's no distinction between Jews serving and non-Jews serving.
So you kind of answered the question that I was about to ask, but I'll ask in a different way. What do you think? And you also mentioned it briefly in the presentation with the idea that people were saying that Jews hadn't served in the military for the United States. What do you think, if there is any misconceptions that you deal with as a member of the Jewish war veterans in regards to Jews in military service?
One issue is and I think all the veterans organizations are facing this, young folks aren't joiners.
Mm.
Um, I saw something recently, the Vietnam Veterans of America, which is a war-specific group of veterans. As I recall, there was the Spanish American veterans and so forth, the Civil War veterans. Those groups have aged out. Their membership has all passed away. The head of the Vietnam veterans, John Rowan, I remember sitting next to him at a breakfast at the White House.
Mhm.
He's a good guy. He really put that organization together, and he's put out some feelers. And I don't want to speak for him, but maybe we should open up our doors to all veterans,
Mm.
so that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, because when you look at it, the youngest Vietnam veteran is what, 65 years old, maybe 70 years old. We're a dying organization. um, so Vietnam veterans were looking at to maybe expanding to other wars. Personally, I don't think that's going to fly. But I'm not the decision maker. The American Legion has been open to veterans of all wars, so it gets replenished. Hopefully, one of these it'll dry out because we won't have any wars. But
Right.
Jewish war veterans similarly is shrinking badly because it's it's if you want to look at the curve, the World War II veterans were a huge influx. Korean veterans, Vietnam veterans, the size of the military and also the number of people in the military has shrunk. Um, I did. I looked at the age. Excuse me. I looked at the ages of World War of JWV members in New Jersey,
Mhm.
and excuse me, they tend to be towards the older side. You don't have a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds.
Mm.
And we've reached out to there are 20 and 30-year-old Jews who are in the service or who were in the service. They tend not to be joiners.
Mm.
That's just a social cultural thing. I imagine lots of other social organizations, be it the Knights of Columbus or the Elks and so forth and so on, have similar challenges.
So, to kind of wrap up, because I do want an opportunity for people to again watch this, and what we'll do is we'll provide the link you were talking about for your testimony within the subscription, and we'll send that out as well. For anyone who really learned a lot from this and loved you when we did the July 4th interview, who would love to either get in touch with you or would love to learn more about you, can you tell us again what's the best way for people to find you?
Okay. Email is probably the best. First of all, let me say that everything I say is me, not the official standpoint of any organization. My own personal stupidity as opposed to organizational. I'll leave the next word blank. Um, Easiest is jwv.carl@gmail.com.
Mm.
And if you know Gmail, the dot is just there for JWV Carl and JWV.Carl are equivalent. The dots are there just to make it more legible. And I can't promise I'll answer. And if you're on a soapbox, I won't respond.
Well, we do, and I believe you have a website, if I remember correctly, from our.
Yes, the website is processmakesperfect.net, N-E-T, and it tells way too much about me, but it's much more of a professional website. I recently, about a year ago, I got a master's degree in criminal justice. So if any police chiefs are out there and want a 74-year-old rookie, just call me and somehow get waivers on the physical. And um, again, that website is basically a business website, but it includes a few odds and ends that might be of interest.
Well, Carl, I want to thank you so much for once again speaking with us, for giving this wonderful presentation about some of the Jewish history in regards to military service. We look forward to hopefully having you again in the future. For everyone out there who's been watching this, I want you to stay safe, stay healthy. I hope you will be well. Carl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, especially Dustin. Today's day 114 of self-quarantine here in New Jersey, and it's great to be able to speak with folks. Again, thanks for the opportunity. Again, I want to thank the National Museum of American Jewish Military History for their PowerPoints and such. And anything stupid said falls on my shoulders. Mea culpa. Thank you.
This is fantastic. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day today.
Thank you.